My life ran on a schedule of quiet competence. I was 38 years old, and the loudest sound in my house was usually the hum of the refrigerator or the precise click of a chisel striking maple in my workshop. My name is Alex, and for 2 years, since the ink dried on the divorce papers, my world had been plain smooth, sanded down to a predictable, splinter-free existence. My ex-wife, Sarah, had once described me as being as reliable as a sunrise, and just as exciting. She hadn't meant it as a compliment. She'd said it during the conversation that unraveled a decade of marriage, her voice not angry, but weary, as if my steadiness was a heavy blanket she could no longer bear to sleep under. I didn't fight her. Fighting wasn't in my nature. I was a builder, a fixer. I solved problems with logic and sturdy joinery, not with raised voices and messy emotions. When she said she wanted more spontaneity, more chaos, more life, I simply nodded, packed her things into neatly labeled boxes, and helped her load them into the moving van. It was the most practical, amicable, and soul-crushingly quiet ending imaginable. In the aftermath, I had embraced the quiet. I told myself it was peace. My house, a modest bungalow I'd painstakingly restored myself, was a testament to my nature. The floors were level, the walls were plumb, and every object had its place. My workshop behind the house was my sanctuary, a place of fragrant cedar shavings and the satisfying rasp of a hand plane. I made custom furniture, pieces built to last for generations, each one a quiet rebellion against the disposable, thrill-seeking world Sarah had craved. I had my work, my routine, my meticulously maintained yard. I was settled. It was a word that felt like both an achievement and a sentence. I had mistaken emotional caution for wisdom, building a fortress of solitude and calling it a home. I was safe. I was predictable. I had to admit in the silent hours before dawn, profoundly and unshakably bored with myself. The house next door had been empty for nearly a year, a silent gray box ever since old Mr. Henderson had passed away. Then, one Saturday in early June, the quiet was broken. A moving truck, large and ridiculously yellow, wheezed to a stop at the curb, its air brakes hissing like a dragon with allergies. I watched from my kitchen window, a mug of coffee warming my hands, as the ramp came down with a deafening clang. And then I saw her. She emerged from the passenger side of a dusty sedan, shielding her eyes against the morning sun. She wasn't classically beautiful in the way Sarah had been, all polished surfaces and bright, easy smiles. This woman was composed. That was the word that came to mind. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy but functional knot, and she wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. As two movers, beefy guys who looked like they wrestled bears for fun, started wrestling with a large floral sofa, she directed them with a calm authority that belied her slight frame. I spent the next hour pretending to weed a flower bed that was already immaculate, just for a better vantage point. I learned more from observation than I ever did from conversation. I saw the way her shoulders sagged for a brief moment when she thought no one was looking, a flash of pure exhaustion. I saw her share a joke with one of the movers, a genuine, throaty laugh that carried across the lawn and seemed to startle the robins. And then I saw the box. It was one of those essentials boxes overfilled with random kitchen items. As she lifted it, the bottom gave way. A cascade of coffee mugs, silverware, and what looked like a ceramic rooster rained down onto the driveway with a series of shattering cracks and clatters. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, staring at the mess. She closed her eyes, took one long, slow breath, and then slowly bent down to start picking up the pieces. It was that single, quiet act of resilience that moved me. Before I even knew what I was doing, I had dropped my trowel, wiped my hands on my jeans, and was walking across the lawn that separated our two predictable, quiet lives. "Looks like you could use an extra set of hands," I said. My voice sounded rusty and used to initiating contact with a stranger. She looked up, and for the first time, I saw her eyes. They were the color of moss after a rainstorm, a deep, intelligent green, and they were assessing me with a frankness that was startling. There was no artifice, no flirtation, just a direct, curious gaze. "You must be the neighbor," she said, her voice a little husky. "The one with the suspiciously perfect lawn." I felt a faint flush creep up my neck. "Alex." And it's not suspicious, it's just methodical. A small smile touched her lips, a subtle upward curve that transformed her face, softening the weary lines around her eyes. "Elena," she said, extending a hand that was surprisingly strong. "And I appreciate methodical. Right now, my life is the opposite of that." She gestured to the broken rooster and the scattered forks. Case in point, we spent the next 10 minutes cleaning up the debris, our conversation consisting of the simple, functional language of a shared task. "Hand me that dustpan. Watch out for that shard of ceramic." Yet in that small space, a current of something unfamiliar passed between us. It was the easy rhythm of two people working together, a quiet understanding that didn't require pointless chatter. I found myself intensely aware of the details of her. The way a stray strand of dark hair caught the sunlight, the focused frown on her face as she carefully picked up a broken handle, the surprising grace in her movements. She was a puzzle of contrasts, weary but strong, serious but with a hint of a smile always waiting in the wings. For the first time in 2 years, the quiet in my world felt less like peace and more like a profound and troubling silence. My predictable, settled life had just been presented with a variable it couldn't account for, and a part of me I thought had gone dormant was terrifyingly, exhilaratingly awake. A few days passed. The moving truck was gone, and signs of life began to bloom from the gray house next door. A pot of bright red geraniums appeared on the front step. At night, a warm, golden light shone from the living room window. I found myself inventing reasons to be in my yard, trimming hedges that were already perfectly sculpted, checking the sprinkler heads for the 3rd time in a week. Each time, I hoped for a glimpse of her, a wave, another brief, functional conversation. I was acting like a teenager with a crush, and the self-aware part of my brain found it pathetic. The rest of me didn't seem to care. Then, on a Tuesday evening, as I was sitting on my back porch, nursing a cold beer and watching the sky bleed from orange to purple, she appeared at the edge of my property line, near the old wooden fence that separated us. "Alex," she called out, her voice soft but clear in the still air. I stood up, my heart giving a ridiculous little thump against my ribs. "Elena, everything okay?" She walked towards me, moving with that same deliberate grace I'd noticed before. She was holding 2 bottles of beer, condensation tracing lines down the dark brown glass. "I come bearing a peace offering and a proposition," she said, her moss-green eyes crinkling at the corners. She held one of the bottles out to me. "For the suspicion I cast upon your lawn." I took it, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. A jolt, small but unmistakable, shot up my arm. "Apology accepted," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "And the proposition." She gestured with her bottle towards the fence. It was a standard 6-foot privacy fence, weathered to a silvery gray, solid and unremarkable. I checked it myself when I moved in. It was sturdy, built to last. "This old thing," she said. "It's seen better days. A few of the posts feel a little loose, and that panel over there looks like it's starting to warp. I was wondering, since you're clearly a man who knows his way around maintaining things, if I could hire you to fix it." I looked at the fence. Then I looked at her. Her expression was perfectly earnest. I walked over to the panel she'd indicated, pressing my hand against it. It was solid as a rock. I nudged the nearest post with my foot. It didn't budge. There was absolutely nothing wrong with this fence. My methodical brain cataloged the facts. The posts were set in concrete. The wood was cedar and resistant to rot. The construction was sound. "It seems pretty solid to me," I said, turning back to her. She took a slow sip of her beer, her eyes holding mine over the rim of the bottle. "Maybe," she said, a hint of challenge in her tone, "but I'd feel better if it was done right. Properly reinforced. I don't want to wake up one morning and find it leaning into your yard. I'll pay you well, of course. Your time is valuable. Think of it as preventative maintenance. And please don't rush. I'm more concerned with it being done thoroughly than done quickly. Every logical instinct I had told me to say no, to point out that she was about to waste her money on a perfectly functional fence. But logic had very little to do with the way I was feeling. She was offering me a reason, an excuse to spend time in her orbit. She was giving me a project, a task, something my hands and mind could focus on while the rest of me figured out what to do with this strange, hopeful feeling. To do it slowly. It was an invitation disguised as a work order. All right, I heard myself say. I could take a look. I've got some projects going, but I can fit in over the next week or 2 inch. A genuine, brilliant smile lit up her face, and it felt like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. That's wonderful. Thank you, Alex. And so it began. The Great Fence Project. The next afternoon, I gathered my tools and headed over. We spent the first hour doing a thorough inspection. This mostly consisted of me pointing at perfectly stable sections of the fence while she nodded seriously, asking intelligent-sounding questions about wood types and sealant. The pretense was so thin it was transparent, and yet we both dutifully played our parts. This post here, I said, tapping a post that could have stopped a charging rhino. I could dig it out and reset it in fresh concrete, just to be sure. That sounds incredibly thorough, she replied, her voice laced with an amusement that only I seemed to be privy to. An excellent idea. The work itself was minimal, but the time it afforded us was immeasurable. I'd work for 20 minutes, meticulously measuring a board I had no intention of replacing, and she'd bring me out a glass of iced tea. We'd sit on her porch steps, the scent of freshly cut grass and her blooming geraniums mixing in the warm air, and we would talk. She told me about her late husband, Richard, a high-powered attorney who had passed away from a sudden heart attack a year prior. She spoke of him with a quiet respect, but there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite place, a sense of a life lived in someone else's shadow. She was a graphic designer, she told me, and was finally starting her own freelance business after years of putting it on the back burner. Richard liked me to be available, she explained one afternoon, swirling the ice in her glass. For client dinners, for charity events. He was the show. I was the well-dressed stagehand. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a statement of fact. I told her about my own work, about the satisfaction of taking a raw piece of cherry or walnut and shaping it into something beautiful and functional. I told her about Sarah, keeping the details brief. She needed more than I could offer, I said, the familiar, dull ache of that inadequacy returning. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me with that unervingly direct gaze. Or maybe she just didn't know how to appreciate what was already there. Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever framed it that way. In the narrative of my divorce, I was the one who was lacking, the one who was less than Sarah was the vibrant one, the one who deserved more. Elena's simple sentence offered a different perspective, a possibility I had never allowed myself to consider. It was a tiny crack in the fortress I'd built around myself, and light was starting to get in. It was on the third day of the project that the first real test arrived. I was using a level on a top rail, a completely pointless exercise, and Elena was sitting on the steps, reading a book, a comfortable silence stretching between us. A sleek, black luxury sedan, the kind that cost more than my first house, purred into her driveway. A man emerged from the driver's side. He was tall, dressed in a crisp linen suit that looked completely out of place in a suburban backyard, and he moved with an air of effortless ownership, as if the entire world was his personal boardroom. "Elena, darling," he boomed, his voice a little too loud, a little too polished. He strode towards her, not even glancing in my direction. I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd see how you were settling in. Elena's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Marcus." What a surprise. Her tone was polite, but the warmth had vanished from it. He finally deigned to look at me, his eyes sweeping over my work boots, my sawdust-dusted jeans, and my tool belt with a dismissive flick. He looked at the perfectly fine fence, then back at me. "Having some work done?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He turned back to Elena before I could answer. "Darling, you know I could have sent my ground crew over to handle this. There's no need to trouble the local talent. The words hung in the air, a deliberate insult wrapped in a veneer of helpfulness. Local talent, he dismissed me as a handyman, a nobody. The old Alex would have just let it go, would have retreated into a shell of quiet indignation. Sarah would have been mortified, embarrassed by my simple, hands-on profession next to a man like this. But something had shifted in me over the past few days. I felt Elena's eyes on me, waiting. I didn't get angry. I didn't get defensive. I simply straightened up, wiped my hands on a rag, and looked Marcus directly in the eye. I gestured calmly to the fence. "It's a good fence," I said, my voice even and low. "Cedar. Most contractors would use cheaper pressure-treated pine these days, but the original builder knew what he was doing. The posts are set deep." I ran my hand over the wood grain. "The only real issue is the soil composition on this side of the property. It's got a higher clay content, so it holds moisture. Over time, that can cause even the best set posts to shift a fraction of a degree. What I'm doing," I said, meeting his arrogant gaze without flinching, "is ensuring that overtime doesn't happen for another 20 years. It was a masterclass in professional jargon, 90% of it irrelevant to the actual situation, but 100% true in principle. It was my language, the language of building, of substance over style. I hadn't defended my pride. I had asserted my competence." Marcus blinked. He had clearly expected me to be flustered or angry. He had no response to calm, technical expertise. He looked from me to the fence, a flicker of annoyance crossing his perfect face. He was a man used to winning confrontations with bluster and status, and I had just refused to play his game. "Right," he said, clearing his throat. "Well, as long as you're satisfied, Elena." The rest of his visit was brief. He tried to steer the conversation towards some charity gala, some mutual acquaintance, but the energy had been sucked out of his performance. He left 5 minutes later, the sound of his expensive engine a petulant roar as he sped away. The moment the car was gone, a silence descended, thick with what had just happened. I turned back to the fence, pretending to adjust my level. I felt exposed, as if I'd revealed something I usually kept hidden. "Thank you," Elena said softly from the steps. I looked over at her. She was watching me, her book forgotten in her lap. Her expression was one I couldn't quite read. It was a mix of gratitude, surprise, and something else, something deeper. "For what?" I asked, stating the obvious about soil composition. She shook her head, a small, slow motion. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with clarity in the afternoon air. "For not playing his game." Most men, when faced with someone like Marcus, they either shrink or they puff out their chests. They get defensive. They try to prove they're just as important. She paused, her green eyes searching mine. "You didn't do any of that. You just were. You stood your ground by being exactly who you are. Quiet doesn't mean weak." There it was, the moment of being seen. Sarah had seen my quiet nature as a flaw, a lack of passion. Marcus had seen it as a sign of inferiority. But Elena saw it as strength. She had looked past the sawdust and the silence and had seen the foundation underneath. In that moment, standing in her sun-drenched backyard, with the scent of cut grass in the air and the weight of my tool belt on my hips, I felt something inside me that had been dormant for years begin to stir. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about rebuilding something within myself, and I had the distinct feeling that the woman watching me from the porch steps was both the architect and the reason. The fortress was crumbling, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what might get in. I was hoping for it. The week progressed in a rhythm of slow, deliberate work and long, meandering conversations. The fence project became our shared joke, the silent punchline to an afternoon spent laughing over iced tea. I'd spend an hour meticulously sanding a single fence board that was already perfectly smooth, and Elena would watch from her porch swing, a book open but unread in her lap, a small, knowing smile on her face. We were building something, all right, but it had nothing to do with cedar posts and galvanized screws. We were building a space between our two houses, a small pocket of the world that belonged only to us. I learned about her love for old black and white movies, her frustration with clients who thought they knew more about design than she did, and the way she missed the simple anonymity of the city she'd grown up in. She told me about her marriage to Richard not as a tragedy, but as a chapter in her life that had concluded. He had been a force of nature, she said, a man who filled every room he entered, and for years she had mistaken his orbit for her own. His passing was a grief, yes, but it was also, she admitted in a moment of quiet honesty, a liberation. "I'm learning to hear my own voice again," she'd said, looking out over the yard. "It's quieter than I remembered." I, in turn, found myself opening up in ways I hadn't with anyone, not even Sarah. I told Elena about my father, a cabinet maker who had taught me the value of patience and precision, who could tell the age of a tree just by the feel of its grain. I talked about the quiet satisfaction of creating something lasting with my own two hands, a feeling Sarah had dismissed as a quaint hobby. With Elena, my quiet passions didn't need defending. She listened with an intensity that made me feel fascinating, her perceptive questions drawing out stories and feelings I thought I'd buried for good. Our fragile peace was, of course, destined to be interrupted. It was a Friday evening, and the fence project was nearing its farcical conclusion. I was packing up my tools as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. Elena had insisted on making dinner as payment for the week's work. The smell of garlic and roasting chicken drifted from her open kitchen window, a scent so warmly domestic it made my chest ache. We were standing by the back door, laughing about something I'd said, when the black sedan pulled into the driveway again. Marcus. This time, he didn't boom a greeting. He strode up the walkway, holding a bottle of wine, so fancy the label was practically written in calligraphy. He was wearing another impeccable suit, this one a shade of charcoal gray that probably had a name like Executive Power. He stopped on the patio, his gaze flicking from me to Elena, then to the tantalizing smells coming from the kitchen. "Elena," he said, his voice smooth as silk but with an edge of steel. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was just closing the deal on the new merger and thought we should celebrate. I brought the Montrachet you like." He presented the bottle as if it were a scepter. "Marcus, I have a guest," Elena said, her voice polite but firm. The easy warmth she'd shared with me moments before was gone, replaced by a cool reserve. Marcus's smile was thin and unpleasant. He looked at me, at my work clothes, a fine layer of sawdust still clinging to my shirt. "Yes, I can see that. Is the work finally done?" The pause was infinitesimal, but the insult was clear. He was trying to reestablish the hierarchy from his last visit. He was the peer, I was the hired help. "Alex is staying for dinner," Elena said, her chin lifting slightly. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. She wasn't asking for his permission. She was informing him of a fact. A flicker of genuine anger crossed Marcus's face before he masked it with a practiced smile. "Wonderful," he said, the words sounding anything but. "Then we can all celebrate together. It's been far too long since we had a proper dinner. We have so much to discuss. The Foundation Gala is next month, and you, my dear, are the guest of honor. We need to present a united front." He spoke as if I wasn't there, as if he and Elena were a foregone conclusion, a corporate entity. He was talking about her late husband's legacy, but his tone was one of ownership. He was claiming her as part of the estate. The dinner was an exercise in sustained tension. Marcus, true to his nature, dominated the conversation. He talked about stock prices, hostile takeovers, and polo matches. He name-dropped powerful people and exotic locations, each anecdote a carefully polished brick in the wall of his own importance. He directed most of his questions to Elena, pointedly ignoring me unless it was to ask a condescending question like, "So, what is it you people do in the construction business during the winter?" I remained quiet, eating the delicious chicken Elena had made, content to be an observer. I watched the dynamic between them, the way Marcus tried to draw her back into a world of wealth and obligation, and the subtle but firm way she resisted. She would listen politely, then deftly change the subject back to something more grounded, asking me a question about a type of wood or a project I was working on. Each time, it was a small act of defiance, a way of telling Marcus that her world was no longer his. I wasn't intimidated by him. Men like Marcus were all surface. They built their lives out of shiny, impressive materials, but the foundations were often shallow. My life was the opposite. It was simple, solid, built from the ground up with honest materials. For the first time, I didn't feel that my life was lacking in comparison. I felt it was just different. And looking at Elena, who seemed to be suffocating under the weight of Marcus's polished world, I started to think my kind of different was exactly what she needed. The evening finally, blessedly, came to an end. Marcus, having failed to secure Elena's commitment for the gala or re-establish his dominance, left in a cloud of expensive cologne and barely concealed frustration. The moment his headlights swept out of the driveway, the silence he left behind felt heavy, charged with everything that hadn't been said. Elena walked to the sink and started rinsing plates, her back to me. Her movements were stiff, her shoulders tight. "I'm sorry about that," she said, her voice low. "He could be a lot. He was Richard's brother. He feels a certain responsibility for me." "It's not responsibility," I said, walking to stand beside her, taking a dish towel from the counter. "It's possession." She stopped, her hands submerged in the soapy water. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "Yes," she whispered. "That's exactly what it is." We stood there for a long moment, the only sound the drip of the faucet. The air between us was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. The stakes had been raised. This wasn't just a neighborly flirtation anymore. Marcus had made it clear that he saw me as an obstacle, a temporary distraction. And Elena, by defending me, by including me, had made it clear that I was more than that to her. The question of what, exactly, we were to each other hung in the quiet kitchen, as tangible and real as the solid oak of her cabinets. The fence was finished, but the real construction was just beginning. In the days following the tense dinner with Marcus, a subtle shift occurred. The pretense of the fence was gone, but the habit of our time together remained. I'd find reasons to be in my workshop with the large bay door open, and she'd wander over with 2 cups of coffee, claiming she'd made too much. We'd sit on mismatched stools amidst the organized chaos of my tools and lumber, the air thick with the clean, sharp scent of cedar and pine. The workshop became our space, a neutral ground far removed from the worlds of both her past and mine. It felt more intimate than any fancy restaurant could ever be. Here, I wasn't the local talent or the boring ex-husband. I was a craftsman, a creator. I showed her the half-finished rocking chair I was making for my sister, the intricate dovetail joints I was carving by hand. I let her run her hands over the impossibly smooth surface of a finished tabletop, explaining how each layer of oil and wax brought out the deep, rich life of the wood. It was the most vulnerable I could be, sharing the one thing that was purely and truly mine. She, in turn, was fascinated. She didn't feign interest. She was genuinely curious. She asked about the different properties of wood, the history of a particular tool. She saw the art in my craft, the passion in my precision. She understood that the quiet, methodical work was a form of expression, a language I was more fluent in than words. "It's like you're telling a story with your hands," she said one afternoon, tracing the grain of a piece of tiger maple. "All this beauty was just hiding inside, and you knew how to let it out." Her words resonated deep within me. Hiding inside. It felt like a perfect metaphor for my own life. The week drew to a close, and with it, the last possible excuse for me to be working in her yard. I'd restained the entire fence, a project that was wholly unnecessary but bought us another few days of shared afternoons. On the final day, a warm Thursday evening, I packed up the last of my supplies. A strange, sort of melancholy settled over me. The project, our convenient excuse, was over. What now? Would we revert to being just neighbors, exchanging polite waves over a perfectly sturdy fence? The thought left a hollow ache in my chest. As if sensing my mood, Elena appeared on her back porch. "I made lemonade," she said simply. "Come sit for a while." We sat on our porch swing, the chains creaking a gentle rhythm as we swayed back and forth. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The air was soft and warm, filled with the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. It was a perfect summer evening, but it was tinged with an undercurrent of finality. We sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the colors fade from the sky. The easy banter that had defined our interactions was absent, replaced by a more charged, contemplative quiet. I could feel the invisible line of the end of our project, and I had no idea how to cross it. Finally, Elena turned to me, her face partially obscured in the gathering twilight. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and steady, stripped of all artifice. "The fence was never really broken, was it, Alex?" The question landed softly, but it had the weight of a dropped anvil. There it was, the truth laid bare between us. I could lie, I could deflect, I could make a joke. The old me, the safe, predictable me, would have done just that. He would have mumbled something about preventative maintenance and made a hasty retreat back to the safety of his own yard. But the man sitting on the porch swing next to this incredible woman was not the same man I was 2 weeks ago. He had been seen, he had been defended, he had been understood. He owed her the same honesty she was offering him. I stopped the swing with my foot and turned to face her fully. "No," I said, my voice husky. "It wasn't. I knew it," she whispered, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "I saw you check that post the first day." "You knew." She looked down at her hands, then back up at me, her eyes searching mine in the dim light. "So why did you agree to fix it? Why did you keep coming back every day?" This was the moment. The precipice. All the unspoken feelings, all the charged glances and shared laughter had led to this single, direct question. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that was completely at odds with the peaceful evening. I took a breath, the scent of her night-blooming jasmine filling my lungs. Because from the moment I saw you on your driveway, covered in dirt and dealing with a box of broken roosters, I felt something I haven't felt in a very long time. I began, the words coming out slowly, carefully. "It wasn't just that you were beautiful, although you are. It was your strength. You didn't fall apart. You just took a breath and started picking up the pieces. And then when we talked, you listened. You actually listened." I looked over at the fence, a dark silhouette against the deepening purple of the sky. My wife left me because I was boring, predictable, safe, and I believed her. I built my whole life around that idea, that I was the steady, unexciting guy. But when I was with you, talking about wood grain or listening to you talk about typography, I didn't feel boring. I felt interesting. I felt like myself. I turned back to her, my gaze unflinching. I kept coming back, Elena, because fixing that fence was the best excuse I could think of to be near you. I knew it was a ridiculous lie from the start, but it was a lie I was more than willing to live with if it meant I got to spend another afternoon listening to you laugh. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest and terrifying. I had laid all my cards on the table, exposing the lonely, hopeful core of myself. She didn't speak for a long moment. She just watched me, her expression unreadable in the gloom. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand on my arm. Her touch was electric, a spark that ignited a fire deep in my gut. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I was hoping you'd see that the fence was fine. I was counting on you being too much of a gentleman to call me out on my terrible lie." And with that, she leaned in. The world seemed to narrow to the few inches between us. The scent of jasmine, the sound of crickets, the creak of the porch swing, it all faded away. There was only the soft warmth of her breath on my skin, the captivating depth of her moss-green eyes, and the undeniable pull that had been growing between us since that first day. Her lips met mine, and it wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of confirmation, of mutual understanding. It was gentle but sure, a deep, slow exploration that spoke of relief and recognition. It tasted of sweet lemonade and a future I hadn't dared to imagine. It was the kiss of a man who had spent years believing he was too quiet to be heard, being answered in the only language that mattered. In that moment, I wasn't Alex the boring ex-husband or Alex the local handyman. I was just Alex, a man who had finally found someone who didn't just look at him, but truly saw him. The fence between our yards was sturdy and strong, but the walls I had built around my heart had just come crashing down. The kiss on the porch swing was a turning point, the end of the beginning. The awkward dance of pretext and plausible deniability was over. What followed was simpler, and in its simplicity, far more profound. We were no longer just neighbors connected by a fictitious repair job. We were two people intentionally choosing to explore the space that had opened up between us. For our first real date, I didn't take her to a fancy restaurant designed to impress. The world of men like Marcus, with its overpriced wine and performative elegance, was not my world. Instead, I invited her to the place that was the truest expression of who I was. "I have a proposition," I said over the phone a few days later, deliberately echoing her words from that first evening. "Dinner. My place. But you have to earn it." A laugh came through the line, warm and rich. "Oh, and what kind of manual labor do you have in mind this time? Are we building an entire gazebo from scratch?" "Something far more difficult," I replied. "You have to spend an hour in my workshop and pretend you're not bored." That Saturday, she came over just as the afternoon sun was slanting through the high windows of my shop, illuminating the floating dust motes like a galaxy of tiny stars. She was wearing a simple sundress, and she looked completely out of place, and yet perfectly at home amidst the stacks of lumber and machinery. I walked her through my process, from the raw, rough-hewn slabs that would stacked against one wall to the finished pieces awaiting delivery. I showed her the different grains, the swirling patterns of burl wood, the tight, straight lines of quarter-sawn oak. I let her hold my favorite hand plane, a hefty piece of bronze and steel passed down from my father, its wooden handle worn smooth by 2 generations of use. This was my history, my legacy. It wasn't a foundation gala or a corporate merger. It was the tangible result of patience, skill, and a quiet dedication to making things that last. I was sharing the core of my identity, a part of me that was far more intimate than any story about my past. I was half afraid she would see it all as Sarah had, as a quaint, dusty hobby. But Elena moved through the space with a quiet reverence. She touched the wood as if it were alive, asked questions that were sharp and insightful, and looked at me not with polite tolerance, but with genuine admiration. "This is where you're most yourself, isn't it?" she said, running her fingers over the curve of the unfinished rocking chair. "Yeah," I admitted, my voice a little rough. "I guess it is." "Richard had a study," she said, her voice distant, "filled with leather-bound law books he never read and trophies he'd won. It was a room for display, for showing people who he was. This," she gestured around the workshop at the sawdust on the floor and the tools hanging in their neat rows. "This isn't for display. This is a room for doing, for creating. It's honest." Later, sitting at the simple kitchen table I had built myself, sharing a meal I had cooked, the conversation flowed easily. We finally addressed the ghost that hovered at the edges of our new connection. I told her more about Sarah, about the slow erosion of our marriage, the 1,000 tiny ways I had failed to be the exciting, spontaneous man she wanted. I spoke of the feeling of being fundamentally lacking, of being a solid, reliable piece of furniture in a world that wanted fireworks. "She made you feel like a problem to be solved," Elena said, her perception cutting right to the heart of it. "Worse," I countered. "She made me feel like a problem that wasn't worth solving." Elena reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her touch was warm and steady. "Then she was a fool," she said with a certainty that left no room for argument. She had a craftsman and wanted a demolition expert. Then she told me about Richard. She spoke of the loneliness of being a beautiful object, of being constantly admired but rarely consulted. She described a life of glittering parties where she would stand beside him and smile, a perfect accessory, while her own thoughts and ambitions withered from neglect. Her grief for him was real, but it was tangled up with a grief for the woman she had lost along the way. "He didn't mean to be cruel," she explained. "He just took up all the space in a room. He couldn't imagine that anyone else might need some air to breathe. When he died, the silence was deafening. And then, After a while, I started to realize it was the first time in 15 years I could actually hear myself think. In that small, quiet kitchen, over the remnants of a simple meal, we laid our pasts on the table. We saw the mirrored pains in each other's stories, the pain of being misunderstood, of being valued for the wrong reasons, of being made to feel like you were not enough. We weren't two broken people trying to fix each other. We were two whole people who had been put in the wrong frames, and we were finally seeing each other for what we truly were. The days that followed settled into a new, beautiful routine. The fence no longer separated us. It was just a landmark on the well-trodden path between our back doors. My quiet, orderly house began to change. A brightly colored throw pillow appeared on my beige sofa. A coffee mug with a witty design slogan was left by my sink, a silent claim. Her laughter became a regular sound, echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. I, in turn, found myself integrated into her life. I hung a heavy, ornate mirror she'd been struggling with, the two of us working together in a comfortable, synchronized rhythm. I bring her dinner on nights when I knew she was battling a deadline, setting it on her desk without a word and retreating, knowing she needed the space to work. We were learning each other's languages, the verbal and the nonverbal, building a shared life not with grand gestures, but with small, accumulated acts of care and understanding. One afternoon, she came into the workshop while I was wrestling with a complex design for a client. I was frustrated, the angles not quite right, the concept eluding me. She didn't offer advice. She just watched me for a few minutes, then quietly placed a cup of tea on my workbench and left. That small, unobtrusive act of support was more loving than any grand declaration I had ever received. She knew what I needed without me having to ask. She knew when to be present and when to give me space. She knew, it seemed, the very rhythm of my soul. My life, which had once been a straight, predictable line, was now a beautiful, intricate pattern, a dovetailed joint of two separate lives fitting together perfectly, stronger for the connection. The quiet was still there, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the peaceful, resonant quiet of contentment, the quiet of two people sitting in the same room, perfectly at ease, needing no words to know they were home. 2 years. Sometimes the passage of time feels like a slow, meandering river, and other times it feels like turning a page. The 2 years I spent with Elena felt like both. They were filled with the slow, steady accumulation of a shared life. Holidays celebrated, seasons changing, habits forming. But they also felt like a single, breathless moment, the instant I chose to cross a lawn and help a stranger pick up the pieces of her life. A moment that was still unfolding in beautiful, unexpected ways. We sold her house. It was a decision we made together, sitting on her back porch, looking at the fence that had started it all. It was a beautiful house, but it was filled with the ghosts of a life that was no longer hers. My house, the one I had so carefully and soullessly restored, became our house. Elena moved in not as a guest, but as a partner. She filled its quiet, neutral spaces with color, with life, with her. We argued good-naturedly over paint colors and spent weekends tackling renovation projects together. She had an impeccable eye for design, and I had the hands to make it happen. We were a formidable team. My home, once a fortress of solitude, was transformed into a sanctuary of shared joy. Marcus became a distant, irrelevant memory, a footnote in a chapter that was long over. He had tried, a few more times, to pull Elena back into his world, but her polite, unyielding refusals eventually silenced him. He couldn't comprehend a world where a woman would choose a quiet life with a furniture maker over the glittering allure of his social circle. His failure to understand was, in itself, the reason she had made the choice. My sister, Chloe, who had worried endlessly about my self-imposed isolation after the divorce, was ecstatic. "I've never seen you like this, Alex," she told me after meeting Elena for the first time. "It's like you were living in black and white." And she's the one who turned on the color. She was right. And now, here we were. It was a Saturday in late summer, the air thick and golden, smelling of ripe tomatoes and freshly mown grass. We were in the backyard, our backyard, kneeling in the dirt side by side. We were planting a garden, a sprawling, chaotic vegetable patch along the base of the old cedar fence. Her idea, my labor, a familiar and perfect division of our skills. I dug a hole for a lavender plant, the rich, dark earth cool against my hands. Elena was a few feet away, carefully untangling the roots of a rosemary bush, her brow furrowed in concentration. A smudge of dirt, reminiscent of the one she'd had on her cheek the day we met, was streaked across her forehead. She was wearing an old, paint-splattered t-shirt and a pair of my work gloves, which were far too big for her. She had never looked more beautiful. The fence stood behind us, a silent, weathered witness. It looked exactly the same as it had 2 years ago, sturdy, strong, and utterly unremarkable. It was just a fence. But to me, it was a monument. It was the symbol of the best, most ridiculous lie I had ever agreed to. You know, Elena said, not looking up from her task, I was thinking about this fence the other day. Oh yeah, I said, smiling to myself. What about it? I was thinking, she continued, patting the soil firmly around a rosemary bush, that it was probably the single best financial investment I have ever made. I stopped digging and leaned back on my heels, looking at her. The late afternoon sun caught in her dark hair, creating a halo of light around her. Her moss-green eyes, full of laughter and a deep, abiding love, met mine. The world, for a moment, went perfectly, wonderfully still. All the noise, all the insecurities, all the ghosts of the man I used to be simply faded away. There was only her, here, with me, in the life we had built together. Best money I ever spent on a perfectly good fence, she said, her smile widening. I reached out, my dirt-covered hand gently brushing the smudge from her forehead. Her skin was warm, familiar. I thought about the man I was before her, the man who believed his quiet nature was a life sentence of being alone, the man who thought love was a loud, chaotic thing that would always be beyond his reach. He was a stranger to me now. It was never about the fence, I said, my voice low and full of a certainty that resonated through my entire being. It was about you seeing the part of me I thought I'd boarded up for good. You didn't just fix a fence, Elena. You rebuilt me. She leaned in, her smile softening into something infinitely tender, and kissed me a slow, sweet kiss that tasted of sunshine and dirt and the feeling of being completely, utterly, and finally home. Have you ever gone to great lengths just to have an excuse to talk to someone? Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Tell me your story in the comments. What's the craziest or most elaborate thing you've ever done to get someone's attention? If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next.